Okay, well, look, it's great to see you all. Thank you all for joining us from wherever you are in the world and whatever time of day it is, or even what season it is. It's midsummer here in England, so it's grey and raining and cold. So we know where we are. But I hope it's better weather where you are today. So this is a special RBMO live webinar. We've done several over the last few years. We enjoy doing it very much as part of our way of reaching out to our scientific community around the world. But tonight is particularly special because we're celebrating one of the unique aspects of RBMO Journal, and that is the Robert G. Edwards Prize Paper Award that gets awarded every year based on papers that have been the most downloaded in the previous year. And from that list, our editors and section editors will then go into discussion to select the top 3, which are then awarded prizes. And that will consist of one main prize, but also 2 runners-up. And we're really thrilled tonight to have senior speakers from all 3 groups represented at this meeting. Now, many of you will be very familiar with RBMO, Reproductive Biomedicine Online. It was, of course, launched by Robert Edwards, the Nobel Prize winner for IVF in 2010, I think it was, Juan. And he founded this journal almost 25 years ago now. And it continues to thrive, and it's got many unique aspects about it, I believe. One of those, which is, we are a global journal. We're not linked to any particular one society, although we have partner societies around the world. And we're independent in that sense, but also progressive and perhaps sometimes a little risk-taking in what we publish because we want to be upfront with the new stuff. But it always needs to be good scientific quality. And this is always a good moment to reach out and thank all of our reviewers and section editors and all of those who are part of the RBMO community that make the journal what it is, and so enjoyable for Juan and I to look after in our roles as co-chief editors. So this webinar is one of many that we've done over the years, and we're delighted that you can join us. And it's really high time I handed it now over to Juan, who I'm delighted always to introduce at these things. Professor Juan Garcia-Velasco, of course, is well known to all of you for many reasons, primarily as a very important scientist in our field, but he's medical director of EVRMA, chief scientific officer of EVRMA Global. He's a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Madrid University, and also, of course, co-editor-in-chief of RBMO. So, Juan, it's a pleasure to hand over to you, and let's have fun this evening.
Thanks very much, Nick. It's a great pleasure to join you this session. And when you mentioned someone doesn't need an introduction, I think Nick is one example, because everyone knows Nick Macklon, as you know, is Group Medical Director of London Women's Clinic and London Egg Bank and Sperm Bank. He has been a professor, full professor and department chair at University of Utrecht and Southampton and Copenhagen. He was a former member of the ESRE Executive Committee and coordinator of the ESRE SIG in reproductive endocrinology. And I'm very happy that he is the co-chief editor of RBMO, so we can run this journal together. Just some information for all of you. You will be able to find our previous RBMO live webinars on the i3 website. You can find it in ivfmeeting.com. Just for you to know, you will receive certificates of participation credit for this event. They will be posted in a few days, not immediate, but in a few days. Tonight, as Nick was mentioning before, we ask you to place your questions in the Q&A section. We will raise them when we have time at the end of the discussion. And we're very, very happy also to be back with this new RBMO webinar for you. We have really exciting talks from 3 prize-winning papers, as just Nick announced. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our first speaker and the winner of the 2023 RBMO Robert Edwards Prize, Dr. Santiago Munné, speaking about first babies conceived with automated ICSI. You can read his full bio in the i3 website, but here I'll tell you just a few words about him. Again, Santi Munné is extremely well known all around the world in our field. He completed his PhD in genetics from Pittsburgh University, and in 1993, he developed the first pre-implantation genetic test for aneuploidy and PGT for translocations as well. He has shown that PGTA reduces miscarriages And he has published extensively with more than 260 scientific publications. He has been awarded the SART and the ASRM prize papers several times. In 2017, he co-founded Overture Life, a company focused on automating the IVF lab. And Santi is a co-founder and president of Homo Health Ventures, an incubator for early stage biomedical research specialized in reproductive medicine. He serves in several advisory boards and companies of reproductive medicine. And January 2024, he became the scientific director of Progenesis. So Santi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Juan, for this kind introduction. And thank you very much, RBM Online, for this great prize. Obviously, this was a team effort. This was a team from Overture Life, which was headed by Luis Molinedo, Embryo Tools with Nuno Costa, a New Hope Fertility with John Zhang, and also a bunch of centers in Barcelona that contributed with material for research. Okay, so why we wanted to automate IVF, or why we want to automate at least ICSI. So one is that demand, there is more demand than supply. The number of cycles in the US have doubled in the last 10 years. There are not enough endocrinologists, there are not enough embryologists, and this results in high prices. And basically the IVF cycles are concentrated in big cities, but there is a lot of demand also elsewhere, and we cannot supply it with it. That results obviously in high prices. The second is inconsistent results. IVF, it's still mostly done manually. So results vary from center to center, operator to operator. And for instance, even in egg donor cycles, there is huge variability in aneuploidy rates between centers and between pregnancy rates according to SART. So not all hands are equal. This is one example. As I said, for instance, we published this paper showing that aneuploidy rates per center in egg donor cycles vary from 18 to 60%. So huge difference, although all are young, all more or less all egg donors are more or less treated the same way and with the same selection criteria. So huge variability between centers. This is another example. This is eggs from an egg bank. All the eggs were frozen in the same way in the same center and then sent to 50 different centers. And the survival rate varied from 100% to 50%. So huge variability also in egg freezing. So things haven't changed much in the last 4 years. Most of the embryology is done manually, pipetting, preparing dishes, and also reproductive endocrinologists. Most of the time, they do hormonal stimulation based on their own experience or at most the experience of the team. And the transfer of embryos and eggs is done manually. So this is a quote from my ex-colleague, David Sable. You can run each lab like a bespoke artisan kitchen. And that is the challenge facing IVF. It's been 40 years of outstanding science and really mediocre system engineering. So let's take the art out of ART. So what automation should provide us? It should provide us with consistent results. It should provide us with labor savings. It should provide us with convenience, for instance, getting monitored at home for IVF. Infinite data. Right now, all the data it's in silos, in EMRs that we seldom can get information from there. And platforms from where once we have platforms that gives us consistent results, then we can innovate on top of that. And this is not possible because we have robotics, software for robotics, microfluidics, miniaturized image systems, artificial intelligence, and the Internet of Things. So one of the things that at Overture we wanted to do was automate ICSI. Well, I wanted to automate ICSI. Actually, the company, as you know, startups, they want you to focus on a single product to maximize success. Basically, at Overture, investors were pushing really to develop automatic vitrification, which is a machine called a VIII that it's now about to start IVF trials. But I convinced them to spend a tiny bit of budget, 3.7% on automating ICSI. So we had to be very efficient, the team that I showed you before, to develop this prototype ICSI. And basically it consists of a couple of robotic arms, an automated injection, a piezo machine, and a joystick, which the young kids really like, but the old embryologists don't. And I'll show you now how it works. It's a video. I hope it will work. Yeah. So we automated only the injection. We didn't automate the pickup of the sperm because this is quite simple. There are a bunch of companies doing that. So we focus on the most difficult part, which was injecting the sperm. So from here on, it's all automated. So we did first, we tried first in hamsters, and we got the same survival rates after doing it in hamsters or manually. Also, the survival after ICSI was very similar. Then we tried in rabbits, and we tried in different mice, different animal models, because some, let's say, have the same shape as the egg, as the human egg, the same volume. Others have a different zona pellucida, and depending on the model, it's easier to let's say, automate one thing or the other. In this case, also we did rabbit, as I said. Also, we got similar survival rates after ICSI, similar cleavage to cells, and similar blastulation rates. We did also a mice model, and again, it worked very well. We have same survival rates, same cleavage rates, and same blastulation rates. And also we had some mice that were born from it. And then for humans, we started with injecting beads into mice oocytes. We used GBs that were mature, and then we injected these beads. This is another example of one of an injection into a human embryo. It's another video. So when we inject when we do the hole in with the piezo, it creates a plaque. There is a plaque of zona pellucida that we need to extrude. So that's why it goes back. Here you see the plaque. Yeah, there is the plaque. I went through to the same place. The beauty of the piezo is that once you hit it, all the membranes basically get penetrated, so you don't have to pay attention to how is the elasticity of the old lemma. So we did a series of human eggs. These were from 3 egg donors, 32 eggs. 14 were injected with ICSI, and 18 with conventional manual ICSI, and then we compare it. This was done at New Hope in New York in the lab of Dr. John Zhang. And basically, we obtain similar survival after injection, similar fertilization rates, and similar blastulation rates. However, there was a slight decrease in euploid embryos, and that's probably because, I mean, this is a prototype, and we know a few things that can improve, like we could go faster with a better software. There were some issues with the heat, but we think that this could be really improved with more tweaking. This was well publicized at the time, and we got the first babies after injecting using ICSI. We got the prize paper at the ISRM in 2022, and now we're very honored to receive the Edwards Prize, the Robert Edwards Prize for this paper. So in conclusion, the ICSI robot showed high proficiency in injecting animals and human oocytes, and the preliminary results obtained gave us the first clinical babies, and this is some of the authors that participated in the study. As you could see here, Eduard Albo is operating manually. And also, if we didn't spend too much on lobsters, probably we had been able to automate everything else. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Munné. That was it really is an exciting step forward and beautifully presented to the journal and to us this evening. So thank you very much for that. We will be opening up this paper along with the other two for discussion later. But if I can maybe ask one question before we move to the next speaker. How far do you think you are from making this available to clinics to actually purchase and use? What's lying between where you are now and that moment?
Yeah, on my experience with Davitri and ICSI. So with ICSI, we did the prototype. We show it works. Then you have to make it nicer. You have to pass all these rules, all the manufacturing, all those things, and that could take like 2-3 years. We stop at the prototyping, and then we focus on the other machine, on egg freezing, and that's, as I said, is ready now to go for FDA trial. So from conception to trying, and it works, to making it a product to sell, it takes like 2-3 years more.
Right. And do you think that the technology that you've developed here will also be applicable for automating embryo biopsy for PGTA?
We thought about that, and since there are like 3 different ways of doing non-invasive PGT or non-invasive analysis of embryos, from AI, metabolomic, we thought that that's the last thing that we needed to automate. Probably.
Okay, great. Well, look, I'm sure there'll be more questions later. Can I just remind everyone, if you have questions, please put them through the Q&A and not on the chat. Otherwise, they may be missed. So please feel free to do that, and we'll be keeping an eye on the questions as they come in. So thank you very much, and it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker now. Again, a very familiar face and speaker to many of us around the world, Professor Baris Ata. Professor who graduated from Istanbul School of Medicine, completed his REI fellowship at the McGill University in Canada. He's quite unusual in holding a master's degree in clinical trials, also from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and has been very active and remains so in clinical research, focusing primarily on female fertility, particularly clinical aspects of assisted reproductive technology and indeed endometriosis. He's very busy outside the clinic and outside the research laboratory, serving on editorial boards of leading journals, of course, with the most important one being RBMO. He's a president of our partner society, the Turkish Society of Reproductive Medicine, and he's also a past member of the executive committee of ESHRE. He's working at the ART fertility clinics in Dubai and also Koç University in Istanbul. You may know that Baris holds a number of awards for his research, education, and indeed is recognized for his clinical work too. So it's a pleasure to welcome Baris, a friend of both Juan and me, and a great friend of the journal RBMO, to talk about his claim paper, which I know has found a lot of interest since it was published. It's entitled A Critical Appraisal of Studies on Endometrial Thickness and Embryo Transfer Outcome. Baris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nick. I hope you can hear me properly. And thank you for the nice introduction. So let me share my screen. And first of all, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to our colleagues who have shown interest in our work, elevating it to one of the most downloaded papers last year. And I also like to thank to the selection committee for their appreciation. Honestly, it's been a pleasant surprise for us, considering that the paper was by definition a review rather than an original article. However, instead of simply reiterating what has been published in original studies, which has already been done several times, our aim was to present a different perspective on the existing dogma of thin endometrium. So I'd like to also acknowledge and thank to all co-authors here. So Begüm, Adina, and Dr. Döçerny. And I'd like to mention, briefly about how we conceived the idea of this paper. So Begüm is a young colleague I know from Istanbul, who is doing her second residency in the US, and she was doing a rotation at the NIH with Dr. Döçerny, who is, world recognized. And one day she contacted me that they were planning to write a paper on endometrial thickness and IVF success, since I was engaged in the subject already. So they kindly invited and allowed me to collaborate. So what we tried to do here was, we tried to write something novel, even though it was a review. So we focused on methodological issues of the published literature on the subject and to discuss how their characteristics and limitations might have affected the observations and the conclusions. So this way we tried to bring a new perspective on the subject. So to understand anything, how our practice evolved, how certain things are ingrained in our practice, I think it's important to review the history of it. And fortunately, the history of IVF is not that long, only like about 40, 50 years. So it's easy to trace how a certain concept is like introduced and practiced. And years ago, when I was asked to give a talk about endometrial thickness and IVF outcomes in a pre-congress course, I wondered how the magic number, 6 millimeters or 7 millimeters, however you use it, was first introduced into the practice. And this was the oldest paper that anyone can trace it to, by Robert Casper, who is one of the pioneers, and who, anyway, so what they did in this paper was, it was early days of IVF, it's like 33 years from today, and they were reviewing their cases that they had done in the previous year in a paper, and they were doing several retrospective, say, explanatory hypothesis generating analysis. And one of the things they reported is the patients who failed to have a pregnancy might have thinner endometrium. And in this paper, what they reported that no pregnancy occurred when the endometrial thickness was less than 6 millimeters, but whether it was just 2 patients or 10 patients, what was the percentage, how their other characteristics were not mentioned. And then later, we all know, I mean, in several papers, there are people who got pregnant and who had live births with endometrium thin as 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters, 5 millimeters. So that brings the second question: what may be the biological rationale? What may be the mechanism behind a thin endometrium being detrimental to implantation and pregnancy, if that is the case? So, there is a key aspect of claiming a causal relationship between two variables. So whether it is a thin endometrium being less vascularized and less oxygenated, as proposed by this Japanese molecular study, or the other way around, as introduced by Casper back in 2011, as thin endometrium causing the embryos coming closer to the basal layer, where the spiral arteries are thicker and maybe the embryo is exposed to higher oxygen tension, under which they don't perform very well, or being exposed to radical oxygen species. You see, like, the suggested mechanisms are completely opposite to each other, and we do not have an agreed upon biological mechanism with which a thin endometrium may not be optimal for embryo implantation and development. So that's a question mark. Yet, so far, if you do a simple literature search, you see over 600 papers on endometrial thickness and IVF and multiple meta-analyses, more or less actually suggesting similar results. So there should be no controversy after all this work, but it still exists. So we'll try to explore how and why we still question the concept. First of all, when you examine these studies in detail, you see tremendous heterogeneity in every single aspect. I mean, even the day of the measurement of endometrial thickness is not constant. The analytical methods or the definitions of thin endometrium is different. Different statistical methods have been used to define cutoff values, and the study designs are various. I mean, not only retrospective versus prospectives, but some of them already include some interventions to improve endometrial thickness or outcomes. Mostly, I think a common and important limitation is important confounders, which would be associated with endometrial thickness and with pregnancy or live birth rates are not necessarily properly adjusted for. Then, statistics is all about working on a sample and making inferences about the general patient population and how big your sample really matters. So we all appreciate that small samples are not that reliable because they're prone to chance findings. We are often concerned about false negative observations, false negative results, but false positives are also likely, especially if you take publication bias into consideration. Studies reporting, interesting findings, associations are more likely to be published, even if they have a small sample size. And most early studies really included small samples. The IVF pregnancy rates were not that high, event rates were low, so they were not that robust or reliable. Nowadays, we have much larger samples, especially coming from registered studies, but they also have their own problems. Like, if the sample size is large enough, any comparison, anything would appear as statistically significant, even if that difference is not clinically relevant. And a large sample size is not by itself a guarantee that the observations are definitive, unless the other analytical methods or adjustments are used properly. And most importantly, registry data or retrospective data reflects what happened in clinical practice, and if when the original data was generated, the clinicians were convinced that thin endometrium was not favorable, and if they canceled cycles, if they canceled transfers, or if they modified their management of the cycle, it may not really reflect the natural course of events, meaning what would have happened if you transferred the embryos on thin endometrium. Okay? So Begum did this nice graph which shows when we tried to see if the prevalence of thin endometrium was more or less constant across different studies. I mean, since you wouldn't expect biology of endometrium to change with geography or between clinics, in different studies, you could reasonably expect to observe a prevalence of endometrium that's more or less similar between different locations and different clinics. But here, what you see on the x-axis, the sample size of individual studies, each dot represents a study. And on the y-axis, you see the prevalence of thin endometrium defined by 7 millimeters or less. You see the white gap, and the yellow dot on the top is one of our former studies where we reported live birth rates when the transfer was done without taking endometrial thickness into consideration. So in that case, 7 millimeters or less was more than 10%. So suggesting that those other studies with low prevalences as 1 to 2% even may not be reflecting the natural course of events, and women with thin endometrium might have had their transfers canceled, and they may not have been represented in that data sets. That's one of the most important problems, in my opinion. So measurement is all about precision. So if you look at earlier studies of endometrial thickness, you would see papers where the measurements were even done with transabdominal ultrasound, and the ultrasound equipment were not as good as today. So let me quote a sentence from an earlier study where they reported significantly thinner endometrium. What they did was they were doing transabdominal monitoring, and they measured endometrial thickness 2 days before the trigger because the authors were concerned that ultrasound examinations might have actually can trigger ovulation from the mature follicles. Right? So that was the experience and knowledge at the time. Today we are using different machines, much higher resolution, wonderful transvaginal probes. But even today, let's see if the measurements are precise or reproducible to inform our clinical decisions, important decisions like canceling an embryo transfer based on a 1 millimeter difference, whether it's being thinner or thicker than 6 or 7 millimeters. So this is one of my favorite studies published by Christine de Gater more than 20 years ago. What they did was with transvaginal ultrasound, 2 doctors scanned the same patient like 10 minutes apart. And here you see a limit of agreement analysis. You see the variation between the 2 measurements of the same patient 10 minutes apart by 2 senior doctors. The differences can be as large as 2-3 millimeters. Even though the variance is smaller with thinner endometrium, still it may be as high as like 1 millimeter. So that makes me question, should we rely on a 1 millimeter difference? Should we have one cutoff with a measurement that's not perfectly reproducible and may even depend on who scans the patient, despite all the efforts to standardization? So the next subject we addressed in the paper was how the data in the original papers were analyzed. So looking at the association between 2 variables like endometrial thickness and pregnancy rates or live birth rates, we first need to determine if there is any association at all. And if there is it linear? Is it U-shaped? Is it reverse U-shaped? And in biology, to claim causality, one of the criteria is observing sort of a dose response effect or a biological gradient. So if a thin endometrium is not a good thing, you should observe normally a linear relationship that, with increasing endometrial thickness, you would expect to have higher pregnancy or live birth rates. If you assume, too thin or too thick is not ideal, then you would expect probably a reverse U-shaped relationship. So why this is important? So in most papers, these are not presented graphically or even verbally. And that brings the next question. When we read papers now with wider access to statistical software and better computers, in most papers we read a regression analysis being done, adjusting for some covariates. But what is in a name? Regression models are not the same. You need to use different regression models, different adjustments for different types of relations. I mean, if it's a linear relationship, you use a different model. If it's a U-shaped relationship, you use a different model. Unfortunately, and this is not limited to the subject of endometrial thickness, these regression models are not defined in adequate detail for not only the readers, but even the reviewers to assess the robustness of analysis. So we shouldn't take it for granted that if the authors mention a regression analysis being done, then everything is not necessarily adjusted for. So this is a crucial aspect missing in most papers. So as mentioned, for causality criteria, we would expect a biological gradient, and probably we would observe, at least in a certain range, a linear relationship. And then if endometrial thickness mattered, how do we handle it at the clinic? Do we just choose a cutoff, which would be called dichotomization, which has the underlying assumption that, on each side of that cutoff, the results should be, significantly different, right? So if it's like, say, 9 millimeters, everything is wonderful. If it's 6 millimeters, if it's 7 millimeters, it's terrible. So I don't think that really happens much in biology. And again, when we looked at the thresholds, when we looked at the cutoffs in the published papers, as you see here, the cutoffs were defined in so many different ways, determined in so many different ways. And you see in some papers, it was as low as 6 millimeters. In some papers, actually in one paper, it was as thick as 14 millimeters. So how do we choose, even if we assume there's a cutoff, whether it's 6 millimeters, 7 millimeters, or 8 millimeters? Actually, if we would make a data-informed selection, I would suggest we should have chosen 8 millimeters, but not 7 or 6, because the studies with 8 millimeters has demonstrated higher area under the curve values than the other ones. But if you choose 8 millimeters, you would almost cancel close to half of your patients. So that kind of brings the question whether the 6 or 7 millimeter threshold is a choice of convenience, or is it really a biological fact? Okay. So, everyone can criticize previous work, but you should bring something new to the table. We kind of try to define how an ideal study, how a definitive study can be conducted. First of all, it should be prospective. Intracavitary pathology that may affect endometrial thickness per se and the chance of pregnancy should be ruled out reliably. The ideal outcomes should be live birth and even obstetric outcomes. And the management of the cycle should not be modified for endometrial thickness. Then when the data is generated, the type of association should be determined. And based on that, proper confounders should be selected and adjusted simultaneously. And we should quantify the effect estimate. What is how much the chances of a pregnancy and live birth effect is affected if the endometrium is thinner by 1 millimeter or below a threshold, and is it worth to modify our management of the cycle? So the ideal study does not exist yet, at least it's not published yet, but the studies that resemble sort of this or have some of these design features. So let me review their outcomes briefly. So in all the systematic reviews, they more or less include, similar studies. The majority of the studies are retrospective, and in this most recent one, only 9 of the 30 studies were prospective. The cutoff levels varied between 6 and 14 millimeters. But importantly, in contrast to retrospective studies, results of which might have been affected by practice pattern, in the prospective studies where management was not modified on endometrial thickness, there wasn't a significant difference between thin and thick endometrial. So I think that brings a big question mark. And here's one of our 2 studies where we reported the live birth rates when the decisions, when cycle management was not based on endometrial thickness. This is the study we published in 2021. That's from Istanbul. This is not with PGTA. And you see the range of endometrial thickness. For fresh or frozen cycles, we did not observe a trend, a difference between live birth rates and endometrial thickness when the transfers were done without considering endometrial thickness once premature progesterone exposure and intracavitary pathology were excluded in advance. And consistently, this is our other study from the UAE. This one includes euploid blastocyst transfers, which decreases in the context of the study, which significantly decreases the variability in the embryo's potential for implantation in live birth by transferring on euploid embryos. And here, instead of a table, we constructed this conditional density plots, which shows live birth rates across endometrial thickness in overall data and then broken down into programmed and natural cycles. As you see, there is no apparent either a linear or a U-shaped relationship between endometrial thickness and live birth rate. It seems to be not necessarily related. And in our euploid transfer data, the live birth rate when the endometrial thickness was less than 6 millimeters was almost 47%, not significantly different than the overall group. And in our former study, without PGTA, it was almost 42% anyways. So even if one assumes, thinner than 6 millimeters may be a problem, as you see, there are still very decent live birth rates. And looking at causality, the graph may suggest, so if it's thicker than 10 millimeters, the results are fine, but you see it's not necessarily a pattern, because you can also claim that around 5 millimeters in program cycles, there's another peak. So these are like random variations due to, still, despite having almost 1,000 embryo transfers here, still probably smaller number of patients in those areas. But to us, it doesn't show a clear cutoff below which we should cancel the transfers. So overall, our conclusion was there wasn't a strong and apparent relationship between endometrial thickness and live birth rates. And certainly the data did not necessarily suggest a cutoff level under which you should cancel embryo transfer for the benefit of the patient, as long as you rule out intracavitary pathology, adhesions, which may cause thin endometrium by a different mechanism, and as long as you rule out premature progesterone exposure. And this is also important once you consider that there's no proven method to change endometrial thickness. That reminds me 2 things. One is, we need to accept the things we can't change, and rather than postponing and dragging treatment cycles, maybe it's best we move on. And that was already sort of the conclusion in the ovarian stimulation guideline of ESHRE. More or less the same conclusion. So there's not enough evidence to modify management of a cycle based on endometrial thickness. So if you cancel the cycle anyways, you're guaranteeing failure. So those were the points we tried to make in the paper and tried to induce our colleagues and our fellow researchers to question sort of existing dogma and design better conclusive studies that would help us and the patients I mean, personally, it kind of bugs me considering how many hundreds and maybe even thousands of transfers are being canceled with inconclusive evidence. So thank you for your attention. I'll stop sharing now. I hope I remained in the time.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Ata, for this very thorough and intensive review of the literature, and for challenging one of the many dogmas that we still have in our environment that become absolute truths, but then when you try to go back and analyze, there's no strong support for them. And I think this is how we are trained. We usually see how our seniors do things, we copy and we do it, but we need to do, as you mentioned, a lot of critical thinking, trying to understand this a little bit better. But it's true that I think we as clinicians, we have simple minds. We want simple questions, simple answers. So more than 7, go, less than 7, don't go. And I think it's a little bit more complex than that, according to you. We will have time for questions later, but I think one of the key elements here is the methodology that you clearly explained, how you measure the endometrium and the variability inter and intra operator. So that means that, you know, we are obsessed with a number, but if you and I scan the same patient, we may have different measurements.
I mean, I certainly agree. You know, like we need to acknowledge our limitations. I mean, our equipment, our techniques, and you know, I think we really kind of need to accept the fact that, you know, we're not that precise. So canceling a cycle just because what we measure seems to be 1 millimeter less than what we want it to be, I doubt if it really helps the patients or ourselves.
Okay, thank you so much, Baris. We will continue later. We'll have plenty of time for discussion, and I see there's a lot of questions coming from the audience. So please continue putting your questions in the Q&A section, and we will have the time for the questions after the next speaker presentation. And I have the pleasure to introduce you our next speaker, which is Dr. Mina Alikani, who is representing the group of contributors to the second of our 2 acclaimed RGE prize paper. The title of the paper is Sustainability in the IVF Laboratory, Recommendations of an Expert Panel. Mina obtained her PhD in 2006 from Monash University under the mentorship of Professor Alan Tronson. She's a clinical consultant and board certified high complexity lab director in assisted human reproduction. She provides expert guidance and support to embryology and andrology labs. And as we all know, Mina has extensive experience in setting up and directing successful laboratories, ensuring effective quality management, compliance, and best practices in all aspects of lab operations and patient care. She is also science editor with more than a decade of experience at RBMO, one of the best, if not the best journal out there, and has authored and co-authored more than 80 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters and lectures around the world on various topics related to assisted reproduction. Dr. Alikani is also the president of Alpha Scientists, who just came from Lisbon from the recent meeting that was tremendously successful. I'm sure many of you were in that meeting. And it's also Alpha, one of our affiliated society partners of RBMO. She sits as well on the scientific advisory boards of Tomorrow and Conceivable Life Sciences. Mina, please.
Thank you so much, Juan, for that kind introduction. First, congratulations to Santi and team and Baris and team. And thank you for selecting our paper as the runner-up for the RG prize paper. We are honored and very pleased. Just a few words about how this paper came about. I'm, as Juan mentioned, the current president of Alpha Scientists in Reproductive Medicine. And we had the pleasure of collaborating with I3 on this important educational project. Alpha and I3 have really a common primary mission, which is to provide an educational platform for scientists in reproductive medicine and those practicing in the area of assisted reproductive technology. We also envision our collaborative efforts like this one to lead to meaningful and positive change and progress in the field. We were inspired by two I3 sessions in particular, where several young embryologists, as well as others, made it clear that their generation is indeed motivated to effect change and take practical steps to reduce our carbon footprint and mitigate one of the most pressing issues in sustainability, which is climate change. Climate change represents a significant and urgent challenge that impacts not only environmental sustainability, but also economic stability and social equity worldwide. It affects natural ecosystems, human health, food security, water supply, and the livelihoods of billions of people, which together make it a central concern in discussions and actions related to sustainability. And while sustainability has many interrelated dimensions, we specifically focused on the environmental dimension. We invited an international group of professionals in reproductive medicine, environmental science, architecture, and law to formulate recommendations for a sustainable IVF. The experts and the panelists met for 2 4-hour online sessions, which itself was a green conferencing format, and various topics of importance were presented and discussed. The presentations were then collated, edited, and illustrated to create this paper that has now won the runner-up RG prize. So let's start from the beginning. What is sustainability? So in 1987, the United Nations Brundtland Commission defined sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Today, we encounter multiple definitions of sustainability, but regardless of the specific definition, they're focused on finding a balance that safeguards our planet and future generations. How is this related to healthcare? Well, ironically, the healthcare sector is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and the associated adverse health effects. And according to an extensive study that was published by the international NGO Healthcare Without Harm, the carbon footprint of the healthcare sector is 4.4% of global net emissions. And that is a significant contribution. They also noted that the US, China, and the European Union are the 3 top emitters. So the healthcare sector's significant environmental impact through its substantial footprint, carbon footprint, resource consumption, and waste generation poses challenges to global sustainability. Mitigating these impacts through targeted strategies such as reducing emissions, enhancing efficiency, and promoting waste reduction aligns with environmental sustainability goals and supports broader public health objectives by minimizing healthcare's contribution to climate change. When it comes to IVF, and IVF laboratories specifically, there are many considerations as illustrated in this figure that we adapted from my green lab. From energy to water usage to purchasing and resource management. We focused on a number of these issues, like how to create a culture of sustainability in science. Pernilla Sorm from my green lab contributed to that section. Whether the industry supporting IVF is sustainable. Anna Gorbunova contributed to this topic. How to measure the impact of our work through life cycle analysis. Cassandra Thiel contributed to this topic. And laws and enforcement of these laws in this area. And James Lawford Davies told us about this topic. We formulated recommendations and action points in all of these areas, and I refer you to the paper for more detail on these. In the interest of time, in the few minutes that I have, I'd like to share some practical recommendations that we offered with respect to the areas of sustainable building, managing waste, and the greening of the cryo chain, which is really quite relevant in the way we do IVF today. And importantly, I will briefly describe a case study of a laboratory in Dublin run by Carol Losher that participated in a certification program offered by my Green Lab. With respect to building green, Charles Calcani told us to select design and engineering professionals with experience in sustainable laboratory design. He told us to consider proximity of the location of the laboratory and clinic to public transport, charging points, and bicycle storage areas. The use of a minimalistic space design was emphasized with flexibility to avoid costly, energy-intensive future construction. The use of locally available building materials was also emphasized, considering both sustainability and, of course, in the context of the laboratory, non-toxicity. And Chip told us to aim for energy efficiency and the use of renewable energy. Roshan O'Reilly and I focused on managing waste. We looked at many different issues under this particular topic. We gave 4 recommendations to focus on preventing waste, reducing use of plastics and other single-use items to the extent that is possible and safe, and reusing what can be reused. Also, exploring recycling and take-back options, segregating hazardous and non-hazardous waste properly to avoid unnecessary incineration activity, and to seek guidance from local and institutional waste management services. While you search for strategies to manage waste, it's important to remember that a majority of the waste that we produce globally ends up in landfills, and a relatively small percentage of about 20% is actually recycled. So recycling, while it's the most talked about way to manage waste, is most certainly not, or it should not be, the first line of action. we gave some examples of how prevention really should be the first approach to waste management. Think about disposable caps, disposable shoe covers, plastic laundry collection bags, disposable garments. All of these could be replaced with fabric and reused over and over. And in the process, you save all of that waste that is generated from these items. And of course, we gave some other examples, and I invite you to see the paper, read the paper, and look at what is possible. Tim Sharp presented on greening of the cryochain, and Tim, Giles Palmer, and I wrote about what could be done and how. So we advise that the focus of cold chain sustainability in the context of IVF should be a reduction in energy consumption, that it can be achieved with the use of bulk tanks, autofill systems, local liquid nitrogen production, and prevention of liquid nitrogen loss during routine activities. We also advised to consider batching samples when possible to minimize the frequency of shipments and limit this activity to when it's absolutely necessary. So, as I mentioned before, Carol presented her lab's experience in getting certified as a green lab by My Green Lab, which was really quite instructional. They looked at their existing good practices, what changes they wanted and needed to implement, and they set out some future goals. And I think this table, if you refer to it in the paper, will really demonstrate how a thoughtful approach to running an IVF laboratory can make a difference in how sustainable the laboratory is. And of course, it may in the end have some economic advantage as well. So for example, Carol said that through waste management, proper waste management, that she said the practical implication of the changes were a reduction in the frequency of waste collection, saving the clinic 968 euros or per month, or 11,600 euros per year. And you can imagine, well, there is something you can do with the 11,000 plus euros that you have saved as a result of choosing the right approach to waste management while promoting also sustainability. So I would like to end with this very impressive figure, which was originally put together by Fran Farley and then graphically reinterpreted by Danny Smale with some modifications during our discussions. It shows the ways in which IVF laboratories can move towards sustainability. And I show this, not that you can see or read all the details, that's available in the paper, but I show this to end on this note, that to secure a sustainable future, it's imperative that each of us commits to minimizing the environmental impact of our work, to safeguard the well-being of both our generation and the generations to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mina. This is a beautiful overview of what's, I think, going to become an increasingly important topic, something that all of us will be engaging in more and more over the coming years. And We are getting some interesting questions coming in through, and we'll be moving into that Q&A session in just a second. But before we do, you showed us quite a daunting slide at the end there, which summarizes all the different things. If there was one thing that we could be doing tomorrow in the IVF labs that could be at least making a start at addressing this, what would you be saying? You know, go into your lab tomorrow and do this. Is there anything that you feel we could be doing now?
That's a great question, Nick. And I think that if you actually tease apart and focus on that huge table, you will see that there are numerous steps that you can do and take immediately to effect change. And they're mostly very simple, but let me just give you one example of waste management, because I'm an obsessive compulsive person when it comes to waste, and it just is an area that interests me in general. Managing your waste properly. So for example, we use so much plastic in our laboratories, and single-use plastics, and we throw them away. Well, what choice do we have? Well, if we think very carefully about, for example, setting up a case, perhaps we could prevent wasting dishes and syringes and pipettes and other single-use items if we plan very, very carefully and pay attention to the fact that what we throw in that garbage bin will end up either in an incinerator polluting the air, or it will end up in a landfill, which is bad for the planet. So it's basically a thoughtful approach to everything we do in the laboratory.
Right. Thank you. Well, I think that's a wonderful statement on which to finish that paper. So thank you very much for that. We're going to move now to a Q&A session. And we're delighted to see everyone participating. That if you do still want to ask a question, please do so at the Q&A. With the Q&A button, you can add your question. Just to get the ball rolling, I'd like to ask Dr. Munné and Professor Ata to come and rejoin us. And maybe I can kick off, Santiago, with a question from Bob Casper in Toronto, who was interested in the increased rate of aneuploidy that seemed to emerge from your paper, although the numbers, of course, at this time would be quite small. And he wondered whether you think that this rate of aneuploidy, if it isn't confirmed with robotic ICSI, could be reflecting oocyte cooling and spindle depolarization, because perhaps the fertilization process takes longer. And other questions have been around about, you know, does this automation actually slow down the process of ICSI or speed it up? So I wonder if you would like to tackle that one.
Yes, at the beginning it was slower, so that could be one of the causes. But the other one, and I saw in the questions, somebody asked about what was the sperm selection, and really who did the ICSI was the engineer. So the manual ICSI, sorry, the automated ICSI was done by an engineer with no experience at all on ICSI. So he actually picked up the sperm, and obviously he didn't do the right way of picking the sperm. So we think that could be one of the contributions to the aneuploidy rate, that any sperm was picked up at random. And we wanted to do it in this way to show that anybody can do the injection. So we use an engineer to do the ICSI. It was not an embryologist.
And another question that you may have seen coming in, and people are, as always, are thinking about costs. In terms of the sort of the cost benefit calculation financially from this, what do you think the case will be for using automation?
Well, I think that, as I said, if this could be done by anybody without previous experience on ICSI, you would you would save on experienced embryologists. Also, it depends on the model that you use. I mean, some people, for instance, with embryoscopes, they charge for the machine, but you could have disposables. I'm sorry, Mina, and charge for the disposable, and then obviously it's much cheaper. If you don't charge for the machine, you charge on the disposables.
And maybe one more question before I hand over to Juan to take things further. Anna Gorbanova has asked how time-consuming the procedure is at the moment, and how many eggs per dish do you load compared to manual manipulations? Would there be any difference in that perspective?
Yeah, this was a prototype. Everything can be improved. So you could. The plan was to develop microfluidics that you could put in a row a bunch of eggs, suck the eggs into a position. So you don't need 2 needles, for instance. You could load a bunch of sperm at the same time. So all these are details that could come later and could make it much faster.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Over to you, Juan.
Yeah, thank you. There are quite a few questions for you, Santi, tonight. So one of them is about probably improving the variability. As you mentioned, things done manually, they have a tremendous variability, and not all the hands are the same, and we agree with that. But when we look at the study, even though it's small numbers, it's a prototype, it's a pilot trial, but it doesn't seem to improve the outcome. It seems that it's similar. Do you think with timing this could be improved? We could get better fertilizations
Yes,
rate?
definitely it could be improved. For instance, we've seen it in, I mean, this was one pilot, one experiment. For instance, with the VIII, we've done many more, and now we are obtaining after improvement, we're obtaining better blastulation rate, for instance, with automated vitrification. So definitely you'll see a decrease in variability and an improvement in results.
There are a few questions, and maybe this was just because of the experiments in animals. For example, Marwa Kefaga asked why polar body was not at 12 or at 6 o'clock.
Yeah, this was based on Nuno Borges' experiments with cytoplasmic transfer, and basically what he has seen is that it's not important where the polar body is. If you really go through or if you touch the spindle, it will move around. So according to him, it's not very important where the polar body is.
And being a bit self-critical, there's a question from Mina Bill. So this automation is fantastic. It may be the future. We will see. But what could be the disadvantage of automated ICSI? Do you see any disadvantage?
No, sorry.
So
how about machines can fail?
Yeah, but the machine was designed that at every step you could control if to proceed or not.
Yes, or intervene, right? I mean, you can have embryologists intervene.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think let's stay with this theme of automation and move to Baris's talk. Baris, one of the questions that's come in has sort of addresses the conundrum as to whether the limitations that you've so elegantly reported on of the value of endometrial thickness relates to the technologies we use to measure it, or whether it's an inherent lack of relevance of thickness as a marker of receptivity. And that one way to do this would be to bring in automated means of measuring the endometrium or assessing quality. We're seeing a lot of this in the lab now with AI and image analysis coming in to help with embryo selection. Are you aware of any studies or any efforts that are being made to automate the assessment of the endometrium in terms of its ultrasound appearance?
So it's a great question. I think we are convinced that AI is better than processing images than humans. So it's apparent in dermatology, it's apparent in radiology, as far as I understand. I'm not necessarily aware of a particular study in the field of IVF, but I know people working on it, and I think, you know, AI processing of the images would absolutely increase the precision and reproducibility of the endometrial thickness measurement, but it won't improve the value of endometrial thickness as a marker of receptivity. Honestly, how I think about this is, you know, endometrium is important. The point of our studies, or the point of this recent paper, is not that endometrium doesn't matter. Endometrium matters. Endometrium is important. It is receptive for a limited period, which is triggered by progesterone exposure. I think one of the reasons we focused on thickness so much, because it was, you know, visible, it was in front of our eyes, we could conveniently study it. And if anyone wanted to do a study, you know, you could just, you know, go through your records, etc. So I think the thickness itself is overrated as a marker of receptivity, but absolutely AI processing would improve the precision of the measurements. But we still need to acquire the proper sonographic image, which depends on, I mean, sonographic angulation, you know, echogenicity of the patient, etc.
Indeed, and there may be, as we've seen, you know, with AI analysis of oocytes and embryos, it may well be there will be qualities of the endometrium which we don't recognize with the human eye, which may prove to be important. And I think I would completely agree with you that, as you said earlier in your talk, that, you know, we tend to worry about endometrial thickness because we sit and look at it. You know, it's something that we see. And when we see any abnormality, we get anxious about it without any good evidence, as you've shown us, that it has really any impact. So that leads me on to the next question, which has come from one of the viewers this evening, is your own practice. I mean, have you stopped cancelling embryo transfers for thin endometrium now?
So just based on thin endometrium, I stopped canceling, actually, I don't know how many years ago. It's been more than 5, 6. Actually, as long as I remember, probably I dropped it like maybe 9, 10 years ago. Because since that I gave that talk in that meeting, when I reviewed the literature in detail, so I was convinced it was a proper marker. So what I do in my practice, you know, before starting the cycle, you know, I need to rule out intracavitary pathology, particularly adhesions, right? Which cause endometrium looking thin. And then endometrium matters. We need to synchronize the embryo and endometrium in the best possible way. So the pattern gives me information about its progesterone exposure. If you're not monitoring some progesterone levels, you can pick it up, you know, elevated progesterone levels by the endometrium becoming hyperechogenic before you expect it to be. So that's also important. And once these are ruled out, actually, I wouldn't cancel either a fresh or frozen cycle just because a nice laminar looking, you know, lush endometrium is 5 or 4 millimeters. And indeed, in real life practice, you know, 4 millimeters is pretty rare, but I don't mind 5 or 6, as our data really shows, you know, not only decent, I mean, live birth rates, and there's no clear cutoff.
So thank you. That's very clear. And I'm sure people will be listening with great interest. You mentioned the laminar appearance. And one of the other questions that came in was whether you have looked at the association between that laminar or triple layer appearance and clinical outcomes, and what your advice would be on that. Is that something we should be giving up as well?
I really, that one, no, I don't think so. So in every monitoring visit, I absolutely take a look at the endometrium from one corneal region to the other corneal region. Okay? And I'd like to see a nice trilaminar pattern. So that rules out intracavitary pathology, I mean, new growing polyps, let's say. Okay. And if it's interrupted at any location, that would mean, you know, there's the risk of adhesions, which I should have diagnosed before the cycle anyways. Okay? And then sometimes the patients use the medication wrong if they buy them in advance. And I remember a few patients that I noticed that they were using their progesterone while they were on stimulation, just because their endometrium turned hyperechogenic in the monitoring visit. So no, I take a look at it, and I think that's how a proper endometrium is supposed to look. And I think the pattern really matters much more than thickness.
So if you didn't see it, you would consider freezing embryos?
If I detect, I mean, it's becoming prematurely hyperechogenous, okay, while it was preliminary at the beginning, it has to be progesterone. Okay? So I would question the patient, I would measure the progesterone, which I'm measuring anyways, though. Okay. But if there's no progesterone exposure, there are very few patients, very rare. I remember just like 2-3 patients in my entire career. They don't necessarily have that clear laminar appearance. Their endometrium is like more grayish. So in those cases, what I did is, yes, I canceled the cycle. I observed her endometrium in a different cycle. And when I saw it was the same, when I was confident that intracavital pathology and progesterone exposure were ruled out, I moved forward with the transfer again with that pattern, regardless of the thickness. And the ones I remember delivered at the end.
Okay, very clear. Thank you very much for that. Back to you, Juan.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Going back to the cutoff, because I see you don't cancel cycles based on a certain cutoff, 4, 5, 6 millimeters. But there's a good question from Carmina Vidal from Spain, asking, would this cutoff vary with the uterine size? It would be the same for a hypoplastic uterus or to a large uterus is the same. Do you take this into consideration at all?
That is a wonderful question. It was something I was wondering myself. I just couldn't design the study, right? So like, how to measure the uterine size and then see if it's associated with endometrial thickness. Logically, it should be, but the cavity is really that small. I don't know if it matters. I mean, let me make a confession. Once I tried to see, I investigated if there was an association between endometrial thickness and the patient's height. Okay, so that would make an interesting finding, and it wasn't correlated. It may be associated with the uterine size, but as far as I know, limited data does not suggest the pregnancy rates are different with unicornus uterus and a normal uterus or bicornus uterus. So considering the size of the embryo, I don't think size, volume, or thickness really matters that much. And I mean, at least for the moment, I wouldn't suggest any cutoff for a smaller uterus or a larger uterus.
Thank you. Well, there's one more take on that, because it's not only that you don't cancel an embryo transfer, is that you may avoid a lot of treatments and add-ons that are being given when we see a thin endometrium and people jump into different treatments and add-ons. I don't know, maybe scratching could be again, alive. It seemed that it was more or less dead, but maybe by scratching endometrium, you could get a better. Do you think there's a resurrection of this, or maybe, I don't know? Now it's very popular, PRP again. Any thoughts on this, Baris?
Thank you for thank you to you and to the colleagues who asked these questions. Okay? So it's so timely, and I'm sure you're aware there's a recent publication in Human Reproduction Update, an individual patient meta-analysis suggesting scratching may be beneficial. So I just did the corrections of a proof, the proof correction for our letter to the editor for that paper. Okay, so I personally don't see the biological rationale, right? And there was a commentary published on that paper which suggested now is the time to investigate the biological mechanism behind it. That now that we saw it's effective, right? So nobody comes up with a convincing or proven biological rationale. So the idea, as far as I know, comes from animal models, but not all the mammalians are intrauterine ejaculators. I mean, in some species, the secretory transformation, the destrualization is triggered by exposure to semen or the embryo. Okay, so the idea of scratching in those animal models was to trigger destrualization with that external stimulus, but in humans, destrualization is triggered by progesterone exposure, not by external stimulus, and humans are not intrauterine ejaculators, so that rationale does not exist for humans. And in this recent IPD meta-analysis, it's a lot of patients It is, evidence hierarchy-wise, it sits at the top. But when you look at that paper in detail, I'm curious to see the author's response so far. I mean, it's not published. We think the results are driven by mostly smaller studies due to publication bias. So in my opinion, the evidence does not suggest benefit on endometrial scratching in general, and I don't see the biological rationale. So that's not something I do or I support. And again, PRP, it's not my favorite subject, but philosophically thinking, I don't think any single treatment works for everything. I mean, how can something, like say, treat hair loss or skin wrinkles or, tendons, muscles, endometrium, and ovaries? So PRP, as far as I know, was first used by orthopedicians to treat, tendinitis, muscle injuries, etc., more than 20 years ago. A few years later, just a few years ago, larger randomized controlled trials are published in orthopedics proving that it wasn't effective, right? So I think we're coming towards that, we'll come towards that point in gynecology too. I wish it worked for the patients, but I don't think so. And you are aware, the recent randomized controlled trial published by Emre, that one doesn't show any benefit for ovary, and the studies suggesting it may be beneficial for endometrium are, not proper RCTs as far as I know, since I question even if thin endometrium is a problem, which I don't know how it would be. We don't have the biological rationale. Then how can we suppose, treating it with something else that we don't know how it even works? So I wouldn't recommend it to my patients, and I'm not doing it.
All right, thanks. There's a very interesting question by Dr. Lexmi Rana. We're talking about thin endometrium today, but she's wondering about there could be a cutoff for a maximum endometrial thickness. Maybe how thick is too thick? Do you consider that? Could you make any recommendations?
Relevant question. That's what I was referring to with, U-shaped relationships. I am not aware of a threshold or a cutoff for endometrial thickness for a healthy reproductive age woman. Okay? So when I see a thick endometrium, like really outstandingly thick, I would question if there's a polyp or intracavitary like fibroid I'm missing. So that's what I would look at, and then I would consider if the patient has risk factors for endometrial hyperplasia or if she has history of abnormal bleeding, etc. If none of these exist, I wouldn't mind. And if we don't see a drop in the data.
One final comment from my side is, so now what do we do? We have these dogmas imprinted in our genes, and the way we practice, how do we change that? How do we break habits? Where do we go from here?
I think it's really the most relevant question. So it's very difficult to break habits. Okay, so I remember giving similar talks on endometrial thickness, on thrombophilia, etc. And then someone from the audience asks, after you explaining for 20 minutes how it's probably not useful, then you're asked, how are you using it? What's your dosage, etc. So for me, I put my mouth, sorry, how was it? I put my money where my mouth is. So basically, how we do it, we just need to spread the word. I think it will become evident with further studies, but thanks to RBMO, holding this event, highlighting these studies. So I think it will spread, and I hope the younger generation will question and learn differently than we did, as you mentioned, just repeating what the seniors did. So they come with more questioning minds, and they're better educated on methodology, statistics, etc., compared to how we were educated 34 years ago. So I hope it will change with generations.
Well, let's hope. Yeah. Thank you very much, Baris.
Yeah, thank you, Baris. I think one way to do it might be to make a calculation of how many babies would have been born over the last 5 years if we hadn't been doing this, and presented in that way. That might be quite effective. But it's been important work, and we're reaching the end of the evening now. But I would like to ask Mina one question, because a few questions have come in around about the practicalities. And I think one of them, which I think summarizes a potential power of embryologists to change is in ordering. You know, if the companies that supply IVF labs are being selected not just on the quality of their products, but the sustainability of their processes, then that's probably going to have quite a profound and rapid effect. Are you already seeing signs of that amongst the suppliers to IVF laboratories?
Yeah, that's again a very interesting and relevant question. I think that the industry supporting IVF, as Anna described in her piece, have a huge role to play here. And I think there is quite a lot of awareness on their part that their consumers and clients want to see action taken toward more sustainability. So, for example, they may be looking at different ways that they can change their packaging, for example, to reduce the enormous amount of waste that we generate. But just box in a box in a box, and you know, these package inserts, etc. Of course, they are limited by regulations, and regulation is not always sort of consistent or with what is good for the environment. You know, it's not always promoting environmentally responsible actions. So yes, I think embryologists and laboratory professionals as a whole can ask the suppliers to be even more involved and ask for solutions to the problems that we face, having to discard packaging material. They can look into better design. They can look at alternative materials. And, you know, they are also interested. You know, we just had this meeting in Lisbon, Alpha's meeting, and we created a competition or a contest among the exhibitors to take actions that support sustainability. And we selected a winner of all of them, just to encourage that thought and just to bring it to the forefront, rather than sustainability actions being buried somewhere on their website and nobody ever looks at. We wanted them to understand that we are interested and we are watching. To select the vendors, we could look at how sustainable they are and what they are doing to promote sustainability. So all of these are really important. They point to the role of the industry in promoting sustainability.
Yes, and the power of competition as well. Well, I think on that note, I think we need to draw this evening to a close. It's been a fascinating evening, and I'd like to thank, in addition to Juan Garcia-Velasco, co-chair this evening, our three speakers, Santiago Munné, Baris Ata, and Mina Alikani, for their excellent papers and engagement in the discussion this evening. Of course, to all of you for taking time out from your busy lives to join us this evening. And with that, I'll hand over to Juan to close the session.
Yeah, I want to thank also the team. Don't forget our team at I3. Thanks to the organizing committee for this initiative, I3, who are Jax Cohen, Peter Nagy, Marianne Seivates, Thomas Elliott, Fran Farley, Giles Palmer, and Violeta Soura. Next meetings, that is good to remind, our next RBMO live session will be held on September 10th here at I3. And much closer, we have the next I3 session, which is on the June 25th, titled How We Operate. That's just around the corner. Many thanks for your participation. Remember, you will receive certificates of participation credit for this event. They will be posted in a few days, not immediate, just in a few days. And that's all. See you next time.